My name is Caroline Whitmore, and I'm 38 years old. Never in my life did I imagine I'd have to defend my inheritance from the very people who raised me. When my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, passed away, she left me a significant amount of wealth. During a family gathering just last month, my parents casually mentioned their intention to use the entire sum to cover Julian's gambling debts. What they didn't realize was that I had already secured those funds in an untouchable trust. The look on their faces when I broke the news, absolutely unforgettable. Before I dive further into what happened, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if stories about reclaiming your power from family control resonate with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Believe me, what unfolded afterward will show you exactly why drawing the line with relatives can be the most powerful decision you'll ever make. The message from my mother, Vivian Whitmore, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon as I was wrapping up a meeting with a client at my financial advisory office in the heart of Chicago family meeting this weekend. We have serious things to go over. Be at the house by 3:30 p.m. Saturday. No explanation, no background. Just another classic Vivian Whitmore directive, sharp, abrupt, and final. I felt that all too familiar knot tighten in my stomach. In our family, the phrase urgent meeting had always been a polite way of saying, Julian has another crisis, and it's your job to fix it. As the youngest, Julian Whitmore had always worn the crown. My parents would jump to his rescue the moment he stumbled. Meanwhile, I was cast as the dependable one, the steady hand who'd inevitably clean up whatever disaster came next. Another family crisis. Isabel Kensington asked, casually leaning against the frame of my office door. She'd been my closest friend since our college days, and now my partner at the firm, and she could read me like a well-worn book. Wordlessly, I handed her my phone, the text still open. Let me guess Julian again. No need to guess, I muttered. She chuckled under her breath. What is it this time? Another failed investment. Third divorce trouble with the IRS. I pressed my fingertips to my temples, already feeling the dull ache of a headache coming on. I'm not sure I admitted, but apparently it's serious enough to warrant a formal directive. What made the timing all the more suspect was that it had now been exactly 18 months since Eleanor Whitmore, my grandmother, passed away. Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had always been my anchor, the one relative who truly saw and accepted me for who I was. While Vivian and Charles Whitmore lavished attention on Julian, it was she who took me under her guidance, teaching me the value of financial autonomy and personal dignity. Her estate was considerable, a stunning historic home in Vermont, a well-curated investment portfolio she had cultivated over many years, and a treasured collection of heirlooms, some of the jewelry dating back several generations. The inheritance process had been lengthy, partly because of the intricacy of her assets, and partly due to some unusual conditions outlined in her will. But the final disbursements were finally set for next month. And just like that, my parents were suddenly calling for a critical family discussion. You know, Isabel Kensington said cautiously, there's been some talk about Julian circulating lately. Lillian Harrington, who works over at the investment firm, mentioned spotting him at the Riverfront Casino more than once last month. That made me freeze. Julian's gambling again. Isabel gave a slow nod. From what I heard, it's been nearly every night, and he's not sitting at the beginner tables. A cold unease crept down my spine. Julian had battled a serious gambling addiction back in his 20s, squandering his entire trust fund, before our parents stepped in to rescue him financially. He had allegedly gotten his gambling under control, but, as we both know, addiction doesn't simply vanish. That evening, instead of prepping for the next day's client appointments, I found myself sifting through years of archived family financial records. As a financial advisor, and the only one in the Whitmore family with a genuine grasp of money management, I had retained copies of nearly all the critical documents. Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had insisted I keep them. What I unearthed in those files shifted everything I thought I knew. By the time I arrived at that so-called family meeting, I was already 10 moves ahead of the scheme they'd planned to strip me of what was mine. Growing up in the Whitmore household meant figuring out your assigned role early on. Mine was clear, the composed, reliable daughter who never rocked the boat. Julian, 2 years younger, played the part of the endearing son who could do no wrong in their eyes. When I brought home perfect grades, my report card might receive a brief nod of acknowledgement. But if Julian managed to scrape by with C's instead of D's, the whole house would light up with praise and celebration. You don't need all the compliments Caroline, my mother Vivian, used to say. You're naturally gifted at academics. Julian has to put in more effort. That kind of logic shaped our whole upbringing. I was treated as if I didn't require recognition because I could handle things on my own. Julian, on the other hand, needed constant hand-holding because he always fell short. My saving grace came in the form of my grandmother, Eleanor, my father, Charles Whitmore's mother, a resilient widow. She had run my late grandfather's manufacturing company for 2 decades after his passing, and she became my source of wisdom, strength, and sanity. She saw something in me that my parents never seemed to notice. You have a mind for finance, and a quiet strength they don't recognize. She once told me during one of our weekend visits when I was 12, they're so focused on what Julian lacks, they can't see the gifts you already bring. Grandma Eleanor Whitmore became my guide and role model. While my parents spent their weekends taking Julian to ball games and movie theaters, she brought me to meetings with her financial advisor and showed me how to analyze balance sheets and income statements. By the time I turned 16, she helped me open my very first investment account, funded with money I'd earned tutoring students after school. Financial independence is real power, she used to say. If you know how to handle money, no one can ever control you. I absorbed every word carrying her wisdom with me. I chose to study finance at Northwestern, then earned my MBA, and completed my certification to become a financial advisor. Meanwhile, Julian floundered. He dropped out of 3 separate colleges before Vivian and Charles finally stopped footing the tuition bills. Instead, they redirected their support into a string of doomed ventures, a sports bar that shut down in under 8 months, a tech startup that never launched a single viable app, and a luxury car rental business that somehow burned through 6 figures before it collapsed entirely. After every setback, my parents would call a family meeting. The discussion always followed the same script. Julian just needed one more opportunity, and family sticks together no matter what. Without fail, these gatherings ended with Vivian and Charles Whitmore rearranging family finances or leveraging their home for another loan to pull Julian out of trouble. Your brother's a visionary, my father Charles would insist whenever I raised concerns. He's just been dealt some unfortunate hands. But it wasn't misfortune. It was a mix of arrogance and poor judgment. Julian expected rewards without effort and rescues without accountability. That same pattern dragged on well into our 30s. While I was building a thriving financial advisory firm, I married Ethan Caldwell, a software engineer who saw right through the dysfunction in my family. Eventually, our careers took us in separate directions, and the marriage ended amicably without drama. Through every chapter, I protected the one thing that mattered most, my financial autonomy. Exactly as Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had taught me. Julian, on the other hand, treated careers, relationships, and finances like temporary distractions, easily tossed aside when they no longer suited him. By the time he hit 34, he had already been through 2 divorces, defaulted on multiple credit cards, and gained a reputation in Chicago's business world as someone unreliable and best avoided. When Grandma Eleanor Whitmore was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, it was me who took her into my home and arranged every aspect of her care. Vivienne and Charles Whitmore would stop by now and then, and Julian only appeared twice, both times to ask her for money, while she was bedridden and fading. On one of her last clear-minded afternoons, Grandma Eleanor gently held my hand and shared something I'll never forget. "I've made arrangements to protect you, Caroline," she whispered, her once steady voice now weak and strained. "The majority of my estate is going to you, not because I love you more, but because you're the only one who truly understands its worth beyond the dollar signs." She asked me to promise I'd handle it with care, to keep the Vermont estate where our family had spent generations of summers, to carry forward the charitable foundation she'd built, and to safeguard the heirlooms so they could be passed down with meaning. "Your parents won't take this well," she warned softly. "They'll try to make you feel guilty, push for everything to be divided evenly, no matter the cost. Hold your ground." And just as she predicted, the first reading of her will unfolded exactly as she had foreseen. My parents were stunned. They received a handful of designated items, and Julian was left with a small trust one he could only tap into if it was for educational purposes or a verified business venture approved by a trustee. I, on the other hand, was named the principal heir. There must be some kind of error. My mother, Vivienne Whitmore, had insisted to Edward Lawson, who had been Grandma Eleanor's attorney for over 3 decades. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted to cause this kind of rift in the family. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can assure you," Edward replied with steady conviction. Eleanor was very deliberate about her decisions. She revised her will 3 separate times in her final year, to ensure every detail accurately reflected her true wishes. In the 18 months that followed, the pressure never let up. Casual remarks during family dinners about what Grandma would have wanted. Emails conveniently linking to articles about equal inheritance among siblings. Thinly veiled questions about when the estate would finally be settled. Still, I stood my ground respectfully, but with resolve remaining true to the promise I had made to Grandma Eleanor Whitmore. The Vermont estate was undergoing careful restoration, following the guidelines of historical preservation. The investment portfolio had been left untouched, with earnings being distributed as outlined, supporting the charitable foundation she had built. The family heirlooms were being professionally documented, appraised, and insured to protect their legacy. Just last week, Ethan Caldwell had reached out one of our occasional post-divorce check-in calls. "So how's the inheritance holding up?" Ethan Caldwell asked, his tone light, but laced with concern. "Still fending off the scavengers." "Ethan," I scolded with a half-smile, unable to suppress a chuckle. "They're still my family." "Family doesn't try to take what legally belongs to you," he countered. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She was safeguarding everything she built from being misused." After I ended the call, I found myself thinking about how right both Ethan and Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had been. Just the month before, I noticed signs that something was off. Somehow my parents had managed to gain access to financial details about the estate they had no business knowing. Minor discrepancies in reports, oddly specific questions that suggested they'd seen confidential documents. Something didn't add up, and with another family meeting just days away, I knew I needed answers. The morning after I received Vivian's text, I contacted Edward Lawson's office and requested an immediate appointment. He had been Grandma Eleanor's attorney for over 30 years and was now managing the estate as executor. If anyone could uncover what was happening behind the scenes, it would be him. His office was located inside one of Chicago's historic landmarks, timeless wood-paneled walls, and aged leather chairs that dated back to the firm's founding in the late 1800s. Edward, now in his 70s, with neatly combed silver hair and observant blue eyes, greeted me with a furrowed brow as I entered. "Caroline, I was just about to reach out to you," he said as his assistant placed coffee in front of us. "There have been some unusual requests regarding your grandmother's estate." Edward Lawson began carefully. From my parents, I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. He gave a solemn nod. "Your father, Charles Whitmore, requested copies of all the financial statements and property deeds. He claimed you had asked him to review them prior to the final distribution." "I absolutely did not," I said firmly, setting the record straight. "I figured as much," Edward replied, "which is why I withheld the documents." He then opened a folder resting on his desk. "That said, there's some account activity I think you need to see." Inside were records showing that someone had attempted to gain access to the investment accounts using the secondary password that had been created during Eleanor's final months. There were also communications with the Vermont Property Management Company, specifically inquiries about current appraisal figures and possible sale procedures. "I don't understand," I said aloud, even though my gut already knew the truth. Why would anyone be exploring the sale of that property? Grandma Eleanor had made it crystal clear she wanted it to remain in the family. Edward shifted in his seat, visibly uneasy. "Your father mentioned something about restructuring the family's finances in a way that would be more advantageous under present conditions. He implied this was being discussed among all family members." "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said tightly. My voice edged with frustration. What exactly does he mean by current conditions? Edward paused, clearly, choosing his words with care. "I can't say for sure, it's not really my place, but he did allude to pressing financial obligations within the family that, in his view, should be addressed before the estate is fully distributed." "Julian," I said flatly. "This is about Julian, isn't it?" Edward Lawson didn't confirm or deny it, upholding his professional boundaries. But the look on his face said enough. I thanked him for being diligent and asked him to continue blocking any unauthorized attempts to access the estate. Then I headed to my next destination, the office of Thomas Grayson, our longtime family accountant, who had handled both my parents' and Julian's finances for years. Unlike Edward, Thomas was far less tight-lipped once I started pressing him about recent activity. "Look, I'm really stuck in the middle here," he muttered nervously, shuffling some papers on his desk. "Your parents specifically asked me not to mention anything until after the upcoming family meeting. Thomas, we're talking about Grandma Eleanor's assets," I said firmly. "I deserve to know if something's happening behind the scenes." He exhaled heavily. "Julian's in deep trouble, Caroline. Serious trouble. Gambling debts," I said quietly. Thomas blinked in surprise. "You knew. I had my suspicions. How much?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Over $3,000 owed to some dangerous individuals Not the kind who just send past due letters, if you catch my drift. The number hit me like a punch to the chest. And let me guess my parents are planning to use my inheritance to get him out of it. Once again, Thomas's expression gave me all the confirmation I needed. They've asked me to draft financial scenarios, he admitted reluctantly, showing how the most liquid assets from the estate could be used to settle the debt immediately after distribution. Which assets exactly, I asked. With clear hesitation, Thomas slid a folder across his desk and opened it, revealing their plan. Liquidate the investment accounts, take out a mortgage on the Vermont estate, and sell off the most valuable heirloom jewelry. In other words, their plan was to dismantle everything Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had explicitly wished to protect. Have they done this kind of thing before, I asked. Used family assets to cover Julian's debts without informing me. Thomas Grayson looked even more uneasy. Your parents refinanced their house twice to pay off Julian's previous gambling losses. And 3 years ago, they sold part of your grandfather's coin collection. I stared at him. That collection was supposed to remain in trust for both me and Julian. It was promised to us since we were kids. I never received my share, I added quietly. I assumed it was still locked away in storage. After leaving Thomas's office, I drove straight to my parents' house, knowing they'd be out at their usual Wednesday bridge night. I still had a key left over from when I used to check on their home during their winter getaways in Florida. What I was about to do wasn't entirely above board, but I needed answers. In Charles Whitmore's study, I found multiple folders labeled Family Trust Restructuring. Inside were draft documents for a newly proposed trust one that would shift full control of Eleanor's assets into the hands of my parents as sole trustees. In a separate folder, I discovered printed emails between Charles and a different attorney, not Edward Lawson, discussing potential strategies for contesting certain parts of Grandma Eleanor's will, if it came to that. The most incriminating piece was an email thread between my parents outlining their plan. Caroline will push back. At first, my mother, Vivian Whitmore, had written, but once we explain Julian's situation, she'll give in. She always does. My father, Charles, had replied, if she doesn't, we move to Plan B. The priority is securing those assets before Julian's creditors take more aggressive steps. Once everything is under the umbrella of the family trust, we'll distribute as necessary. There it was plain as day. They intended to manipulate me emotionally into surrendering my inheritance. And if guilt didn't work, they were ready to use legal tactics to seize control anyway. I snapped photos of the key documents with my phone, then meticulously placed everything back exactly how I'd found it. As I drove back to my condo, I mentally took stock of what was on the line. The Vermont estate that had belonged to our family for over 4 generations. The carefully diversified investment portfolio, worth close to $2 million, that Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had built patiently over decades. And the heirloom jewelry collection, including pieces from the 1890s, passed down through the women in our family. All of it would be sold off to cover Julian's gambling debts if my parents got their way. And once those assets were gone, they'd be lost forever. The legacy that Grandma Eleanor had entrusted to me would vanish. By the time I pulled into my parking garage, the sting of betrayal had cooled, replaced by something far sharper, unwavering resolve. They still believed I was the same compliant daughter who would always put family peace above my own well-being. They had no clue who they were dealing with now. The morning after uncovering my parents' scheme, I reached out to Charlotte Hayes, a trust attorney I knew through professional networks. Charlotte was known for her expertise in asset protection and had built a reputation for being both strategic and flawlessly precise in her legal work. Her office, sleek and minimalist, stood in stark contrast to Edward Lawson's old-school wood-paneled space, perfectly reflecting her forward-thinking approach to wealth defense. "Let me be sure I've got this straight," Charlotte said after I laid everything out. "Your grandmother left these assets to you in her will. The estate is now in final probate, and your parents are trying to pressure you into moving everything into a family trust, one they control, so they can use the funds to cover Julian's gambling debts." "That's exactly what's happening," I confirmed. "And if I don't play along, they've got a backup plan to potentially contest the will." Charlotte's face grew serious. "They have no legitimate basis to dispute a properly executed will, just because they don't like how the assets are divided. But if they're willing to fabricate claims or stir up conflict, they could absolutely drag the process out and create complications." "What are my options?" I asked her directly. "The strongest course of action," she said, "would be to set up an irrevocable trust, immediately, before they can make their move. Once the assets are transferred into that kind of trust, with you as both grantor and beneficiary, they're legally shielded. Your parents would have no legal pathway to touch them. How soon can we get that in place?" Charlotte pulled out her calendar and began scanning her availability. "I can have the paperwork finalized by tomorrow afternoon," Charlotte Hayes said, "but we'll need to act quickly to complete the transfers before your family meeting." "When exactly is it?" "Saturday at 3 p.m., I replied. "That gives us 3 days. It'll be tight, but we can make it work." She immediately began jotting down notes. "We'll need to get in touch with Edward Lawson right away to coordinate the transfers." What followed was a flurry of movement. While Charlotte prepared the trust documents, I worked alongside Edward to ensure each asset was transitioned properly. The process wasn't simple. Every asset type required a distinct strategy. For the investment accounts, we had to create new accounts under the trust's name and submit the appropriate transfer instructions. For the Vermont property, we prepared and filed a new deed, reflecting the trust's ownership. As for the jewelry collection and other tangible heirlooms, we carefully documented their reassignment into the trust. By Thursday evening, I was seated in Charlotte's office, signing the final stack of trust documents, when my phone lit up with an incoming call. It was my mother, Vivian Whitmore. "Don't answer," Charlotte said quietly, sliding the next document across the desk for my signature. I muted the call without hesitation, but only seconds later a text message arrived. "Why were you asking Thomas about Julian's finances? We agreed to talk about everything during the family meeting. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I turned the screen towards Charlotte and showed her the message. "They know you're on to them." Charlotte Hayes said, her tone steady. "That makes it even more important we finish this tonight. Let's get the rest of these signatures done." By Friday afternoon, the investment portfolios had been officially moved into the newly established trust. Edward Lawson had fast-tracked the deed transfer for the Vermont estate. The final task was to collect the jewelry and heirloom items from the safe deposit box held at my parents' longtime bank. This was without a doubt the most delicate part of the process. Although the box was legally registered in my name, the bank had served my family for decades, and the staff knew Vivian and Charles Whitmore well. If someone happened to mention my visit to them, they might quickly piece together what was going on. As the bank manager guided me toward the vault, my pulse quickened. Inside that box wasn't just jewelry. It held personal treasures Grandma Eleanor Whitmore had expressly set aside for me. Her mother's silver compact, her father's antique pocket watch, and a bundle of handwritten family recipes passed down from the late 1800s. When I opened the box and caught sight of the familiar blue velvet pouches, a swell of emotion overtook me. Gently, I unwrapped the emerald necklace Grandma Eleanor used to wear on special occasions, the same one she fastened around my neck The morning I graduated from college. This will be yours one day. Grandma Eleanor had once told me, not just as jewelry, but as a symbol of the women in our family who carved their own paths. Now I was making sure her legacy would be respected. I signed the official documents to remove the items from the safe deposit box, carefully packed everything into my bag, and exited the bank without any issues. By Friday evening, I met with both Edward Lawson and Charlotte Hayes to confirm that every asset had been successfully secured within the irrevocable trust. The timing couldn't have been better. All transfers were completed just under 24 hours before the scheduled family meeting. Your grandmother would be proud, Edward said, a rare smile softening his typically reserved expression. She always said you had nerves of steel when it counted. What should I expect tomorrow? I asked the two of them. They'll be stunned, then furious, Charlotte replied. They might threaten to take legal action, but legally there's nothing they can do. The trust is bulletproof. Whatever happens, Edward added, stay composed. Don't let them draw you into emotional territory. The second this turns into a family drama, instead of a legal matter, they'll use it to manipulate you. That night, I barely slept, mentally rehearsing every word I might need to say and bracing for the inevitable pushback. By morning, I felt steady, focused like a chess player who had already mapped out her opponent's next 5 moves. As I drove toward my parents' home in the suburbs that afternoon, my mind wandered through the many family meetings of the past, how I had so often yielded in silence just to keep the peace. All those years, I had prioritized Julian's needs over my own, simply because it was expected of me. But today would be different. I pulled into the driveway of the colonial-style house where I had spent my childhood, noticing that Julian's shiny new Audi was already parked outside. Clearly, his mountain of gambling debt hadn't influenced his taste in cars. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the folder containing all my documents and made my way to the front door, ready for whatever lay ahead. Before I could press the doorbell, the thick oak door swung open. Vivian Whitmore stood before me in a powder blue cardigan and pearl necklace, suburban matriarch to the core. Caroline, finally. Everyone's waiting in the living room, she said with a bright, practiced smile, the same tone she always used when choreographing one of her carefully controlled family performances. She gave me a brief embrace, and the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 washed over me, bringing with it a wave of memories, some comforting, most not. The living room looked as staged as ever. Charles Whitmore was settled into his usual leather armchair, reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he leafed through a few papers. Julian lounged on the sofa, his body language a cocktail of nervousness and entitlement. He barely glanced at me when I entered. Drink, my father offered, motioning to the bar cart, where his usual Saturday scotch was already poured. Just water, thanks, I replied, choosing the armchair furthest from Julian. I needed to keep my focus sharp. After a few minutes of forced pleasantries from Vivienne about local gossip and the weather, Charles cleared his throat, a familiar cue that the performance was about to shift into its main act. Caroline, we've asked you to join us today to talk about an important family issue. Charles Whitmore began, his tone slipping into the same commanding register he had used throughout my upbringing. As you're well aware, this family has always valued unity above all else. I gave a slight nod, but stayed silent, letting him continue uninterrupted. We've faced challenges before, and we've always gotten through them by leaning on one another, he added, throwing a quick glance toward Vivian, who nodded with exaggerated warmth. That's what families are supposed to do, stand together through difficult seasons. Charles, just get to the point. My mother interrupted, her tone laced with forced urgency. Caroline understands what family loyalty means. My father adjusted his glasses with practiced seriousness. Your brother has encountered some financial difficulties lately. Julian shifted uneasily on the couch, but said nothing. The details aren't important, Charles continued. What's important is that we find a path forward that benefits everyone. I actually think the details are very important, I replied quietly. Vivian shot me a disapproving glance before jumping in. Julian has had a bit of a relapse with gambling, but he's getting support now, right? Julian. He gave a half-hearted nod, still avoiding eye contact. Yeah. I've been going to some meetings and stuff. The urgent issue Charles pressed on is taking care of some outstanding financial responsibilities that have grown increasingly time-sensitive. You mean his gambling debts? I said, my voice level and unflinching. My father frowned, clearly uncomfortable with my bluntness. As I was saying, he continued trying to regain control. Now that your grandmother's estate is scheduled to be distributed next month, we've come up with a plan, one that we believe is in the best interest of the entire family. Charles Whitmore pushed a folder across the coffee table toward me. We're in the process of setting up a new family trust that will consolidate all of Eleanor's assets, he began. Your mother and I will act as trustees to ensure everything is handled appropriately for the good of the entire family. The immediate priority, Vivian added in her most composed tone, would be resolving Julian's current financial troubles. But ultimately, all of it would remain within the family. It's what your grandmother would have wanted. I didn't reach for the folder. Is it? I asked quietly. Charles kept going as if I hadn't said a word. Edward Lawson has been frustratingly uncooperative with our requests, which is disappointing, but our legal counsel assures us this new setup is completely valid. We just need your signature to move forward. He pulled a pen from his inner jacket pocket and extended it toward me, waiting. The room fell silent as I made no motion to take it. Julian finally glanced up, his jaw tight. Just sign the papers, Caroline. Don't turn this into something bigger than it has to be. Still, I remained quiet. Maybe you're not fully grasping how serious this is. My mother said, her voice growing sharper. Julian is in deep with some very dangerous people. This goes far beyond money. How much? I asked steadily. My parents exchanged a tense glance. 327,000, my father admitted at last, and another 80,000 owed to the IRS. Vivian added reluctantly. And don't forget the loan from Uncle Henry, Julian mumbled. So over 400,000 total, I concluded. And your solution is to cover that with the assets Grandma Eleanor left to me, to the family, Charles corrected with a hint of indignation. Eleanor's estate belongs to all of us. Actually, I replied, my voice cool and controlled. It doesn't. Grandma Eleanor made her wishes very clear. The Vermont home is to be preserved for future generations. The investment portfolio is to continue supporting her charitable foundation. And the heirlooms are to be safeguarded, not liquidated. Those were more her values, not legally binding terms. Vivian Whitmore dismissed with a wave of her hand. The will might name you as the legal owner, but Eleanor always meant for those assets to serve the entire family, and apparently covering Julian's gambling debts qualifies as serving the family. I asked, my voice calm but firm. Julian slammed his hand on the coffee table. For God's sake, Caroline, they're trying to keep me from getting my legs broken or worse. Is that what you want? For your own brother to get hurt because you're being selfish. That's enough, Charles Whitmore cut in sharply, though it wasn't clear if he was reprimanding Julian or me. He exhaled and shifted his tone to something more measured. Caroline, we get that this isn't ideal, but it's only for a short time. Once Julian gets back on track, the trust will still contain everything still serving the family's long-term interests. We've supported you more than once in the past, Vivian added pointedly, though we all knew that was far from true. Now it's your turn to step up for your brother. I looked at each of them in turn. Charles's authoritative composure, Vivian's carefully crafted concern, and Julian's raw desperation cloaked in entitlement. They were so confident in how this would unfold, so convinced that I would once again cave for the sake of peace. I think there's something you should be aware of, I said, finally breaking the silence. As of yesterday, I continued locking eyes with each of them. Every asset from Grandma Eleanor Whitmore's estate has been moved into an irrevocable trust, with me named as both the grantor and sole beneficiary. The Vermont home, the investment portfolio, the heirlooms, every last item is now legally safeguarded, and none of you have any claim to them. The silence that followed was total. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed again, no words coming out. Charles's face turned a deep, dangerous red. Julian stared at me in stunned disbelief, as if I'd started speaking in another language entirely. That's not possible, Charles Whitmore finally said, his voice stiff. The estate is still in probate. It's in final probate, I corrected. Edward Lawson expedited the last distributions at my request, and Charlotte Hayes helped me set up the trust immediately afterward. Charlotte Hayes, my mother echoed sharply. You went behind our backs to another lawyer, just like you went behind my back to try to challenge Grandma Eleanor's will with someone other than Edward, I replied. Yes, I know all about Plan B. My father's expression said it all. You had no right to do this, he muttered. I had every right, I said firmly. These are my assets to safeguard, and that's exactly what Grandma Eleanor asked me to do. Suddenly, Julian jumped up, his face twisted with fury. You selfish. Do you have any idea what these people will do to me if I don't pay them? Julian, my mother gasped, though it was unclear whether she was reacting to his outburst or the clear acknowledgement of how dangerous the situation truly was. You've always been like this, he snapped, now pacing across the room. Always looking down on everyone. Always acting like you're better than the rest of us. The perfect daughter with her perfect career, who never needed help from anyone. That's not true, I said evenly. I've worked hard for everything I've built. The difference is, I don't expect other people to clean up my mess when I screw up. Vivian stood and crossed the room to sit beside me, taking my hand in hers. Her voice softened, shifting into the familiar coaxing tone she'd used all my life to bend situations to her will. Caroline, sweetheart, I understand you're upset that we didn't include you sooner. That was our mistake. But surely you can see that Julian's life could be in real danger. As a family, we're supposed to look out for one another, Vivian Whitmore said softly. I gently but decisively pulled my hand away from hers. I agree Julian needs protecting, but not just from outside threats, from himself, and from the enabling that's kept this cycle going. This has to end. You don't understand what you're saying, Charles Whitmore cut in sharply. Julian has an illness. Addiction isn't a moral failing, it's a disease. I know that, I said calmly. But the answer to illness is treatment and accountability, not financial rescues that just allow the behavior to keep repeating. We can take this to court, Charles threatened, shifting fully into lawyer mode. You violated the spirit of your grandmother's will. No, I corrected, I've followed it exactly. And if you want to contest the trust in court, go ahead. Charlotte Hayes assures me it's legally airtight. All you'll accomplish is throwing more money at attorneys, instead of using those resources to address the real issue. Julian had drifted toward the window, his back to the room, shoulders tense and unmoving. Easy for you to say, he muttered. You're not the one who has to face Vincent Moretti and his people. Who exactly did you borrow from Julian? I asked. He turned slowly, his expression a twisted mix of anger and fear. What does it matter? Debt is debt. It matters if they're loan sharks. Or worse, I replied. That's not just a gambling issue. That's stepping into criminal territory. Don't be so dramatic, Vivian cut in. Julian borrowed from some private lenders after the banks turned him down. It's not great, but it's hardly the mafia. But the way she avoided eye contact told me everything I needed to know. She was lying. This conversation isn't leading anywhere useful, Charles said clearly, shifting strategies. His legal instincts were searching for another angle. Caroline, I realize the trust is irrevocable, but as the beneficiary, you still have discretion over distributions. You can choose to help your brother without dissolving the entire structure. That may be true, I said evenly, but I won't be doing that. Then you're choosing to prioritize money and property over your own brother's safety. Vivian Whitmore snapped, her voice sharpening. I never imagined you could be this heartless. I'm choosing to break a harmful cycle, I replied, correcting her calmly. One that you and Dad have spent decades enabling. Don't you dare put this on us, Charles Whitmore shot back, his voice climbing. We've done everything we could to help both of our children succeed. No, I said flatly. You've done everything in your power to shield Julian from consequences, which is not the same as helping him grow or succeed. I rose to my feet, picking up my purse. I'm done playing a part in this endless loop. I won't do it anymore. If you walk out that door, my mother said, her voice trembling either from real emotion or well-rehearsed guilt. You're abandoning this family. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said, turning back to meet her gaze. I'm just done setting myself on fire so everyone else can stay warm. We'll fight the trust, my father called after me as I reached the entryway. We'll claim undue influence, argue that Eleanor wasn't of sound mind. We'll use whatever legal means we have. You'll be buried in court battles for years. I paused and looked over my shoulder. And how exactly does that help Julian with the debt he owes right now? Because I'm pretty sure Vincent Moretti and his people don't wait around for probate court to settle family disagreements. That seemed to stop him, at least for the moment. This isn't finished, Julian Whitmore muttered, his tone low and edged with threat. You think you've got it all figured out, but you don't know what you're getting into. I looked at each of them one last time. These people who were supposed to be my foundation. Yet time and again, they had chosen control, pressure, and manipulation over true support. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said softly. For the first time, I'm honoring both Grandma Eleanor's wishes and my own limits. As I made my way to the car, I could hear Julian yelling obscenities from the doorway. Vivian called after me again and again, her tone shifting wildly from fury to desperation. Charles said nothing at all, and that silence felt more unnerving than either of their voices. Once inside my vehicle, the calm I had fought so hard to hold on to began to crack. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and tears clouded my eyes. I had prepared myself logically for their reactions, but the emotional weight of standing alone against my entire family came crashing down harder than I expected. I drove to a nearby park, pulled into a quiet corner, and finally let myself cry. For the version of family I had always hoped for the grandmother who tried to shield me, and for a brother who might never find his way back to himself. As I sat there trying to steady my breath, my phone lit up with a call from an unfamiliar number. Thinking it might be Charlotte Hayes with a legal update, I answered. Caroline, it's Henry Whitmore. Your uncle, my uncle. My father's estranged brother. Someone I hadn't spoken to in over 15 years. Uncle Henry, I said, startled. How did you even get my number? How did you? I began. Edward Lawson reached out to me. Henry Whitmore interrupted gently. He said He thought I might have some insight, something that could help you see the full picture when it comes to your parents and Julian. We need to meet in person. There's more going on than you realize. I met Uncle Henry the following morning at a quiet cafe tucked away downtown. I barely recognized him at first. The last time I'd seen him was at a relative's funeral during my college years. Now in his early 70s, he still carried the signature Whitmore features, like my father, but time had softened them. His eyes were kinder, his face lined with deep laugh lines that made him seem more approachable than I remembered. "You look like Eleanor," he said, as I took a seat across from him. "She would have been proud of what you did yesterday." "You already heard about that?" I asked, surprised. He smiled. "Of course. Charles called me last night in a fit. Apparently, I'm still the person he vents to when he thinks the family's turning on him. A bit ironic, considering our past. I vaguely recalled whispers from childhood. Something about Uncle Henry being estranged from the family after a falling out with my father over a failed business deal. Edward said you had information about my parents and Julian," I asked carefully. Henry nodded slowly, his expression serious. "This isn't just about helping Julian out of a mess. Your parents are trying to save themselves." Over the next hour, he laid out a financial history I never saw coming. My parents had been quietly covering Julian's gambling debts for over 10 years, far longer, and in far greater amounts than I had imagined. What had started as a few $1,000s during Julian's college years had ballooned into hundreds of thousands by the time he hit his mid-30s. The first real crisis happened 8 years ago. Henry Whitmore began. Julian was in deep. He owed nearly $2,000 to some very dangerous people. Your parents refinanced their house and drained most of their retirement accounts just to cover it. I had no idea, I admitted quietly. They were too proud to let anyone find out, especially you, he said. Charles always carried a grudge about how easily financial success seemed to come to you, while Julian floundered. The next revelation hit even harder. My parents were in essence financially ruined between years of bailing Julian out, making poor investment choices, and their relentless obsession with keeping up appearances. They had burned through nearly everything they had. There are now 2 mortgages on the family home, Henry added. Charles's law practice has been hemorrhaging money for years. Most of his longtime clients have switched to younger firms that offer more modern services. They've been surviving on credit cards and home equity lines, just hoping Eleanor's estate would be the solution to everything. But why didn't they just tell me the truth? I asked, my voice tight. I would have helped them not with Julian's gambling mess, but with their own finances. Henry gave a small, bittersweet smile. Because it was never really about money. It was about control. Charles has always needed to be the one holding it all together, the head of the family. The idea of admitting failure, especially to his daughter, who happens to be a financial expert. He couldn't stomach it. He then reached into his bag and handed me a folder. Inside were bank statements, property documents, and loan records meticulously collected evidence of their downward financial spiral, which Henry had been quietly tracking from a distance for years. "Why are you showing me all this now?" I asked quietly. "Because unlike Charles and Vivienne, I still believe Julian has a chance to turn his life around." Henry Whitmore replied, his voice firm. "But that won't happen unless the enabling stops completely." His expression grew more serious. "And because Eleanor asked me to keep watch if anything happened to her. She knew there was a chance they might try to use her estate as a final escape hatch. With this new clarity, I decided to call another family meeting, this time on my terms." We gathered at my condo with both Edward Lawson and Charlotte Hayes, present to keep the conversation grounded. My parents showed up with stiff postures and guarded expressions. Julian arrived separately, looking worn out and hollowed by his own choices. Before we begin, I said once everyone was seated, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This meeting is not about bargaining over Grandma Eleanor's estate. The trust is already active, and it will stay that way. We're here to talk about real solutions, not short-term financial patches. Charles began to interrupt, but Vivian gently placed her hand on his arm, stopping him. I've spoken to Uncle Henry, I continued. I know about the second mortgage on the house, the retirement accounts that were drained, and the full scope of Julian's debts over the years. My parents exchanged panicked looks. Henry had no business revealing private family matters, my father started angrily. And you had no business trying to take control of the assets Eleanor left in my name, I responded, unwavering. We're beyond keeping secrets. This is about reality now, about protecting Julian's life, stabilizing your financial future, and honoring the legacy Grandma Eleanor tried so hard to preserve. I turned to face my brother. Julian, I need you to be completely honest with me. What's the total amount you owe right now, and who exactly do you owe it to? He glanced at our parents, who gave small, weary nods of acknowledgement. Finally, letting go of the performance, Julian laid it out. His gambling debts had climbed to nearly $45,000 spread across casino markers, maxed-out credit cards, and most concerning of all, loans from individuals tied to organized crime in the Chicago area. They've given me until the end of the month, he said quietly, his voice flat and defeated. After that, they start collecting. That could mean anything from breaking bones to forcing me into work I don't want to do to pay it off. And your addiction, I asked. Are you seriously trying to get help? Or just saying the words? Julian stared down at his hands. I've been to 2 Gamblers Anonymous meetings, he admitted. It's harder than I thought it would be. Admitting I don't have control over it. That's been the hardest part. I turned to my parents. And your finances. No more partial truths. I need the whole picture. With visible reluctance, Vivian and Charles confirmed what Henry had already told me. They had less than $2,000 left in savings. Their home carried enormous mortgage debt. Credit card balances were keeping them up at night. And Charles's law practice, once a point of pride, was now barely bringing in enough to cover its basic expenses. They had pinned all their hopes on Eleanor's estate to make everything right in one sweeping gesture. After a long silence, I took a deep breath. Here's what we're going to do, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going to tear apart Grandma Eleanor's legacy just to support more self-destruction. But I'm also not going to turn my back on this family. I laid out a 3-part solution. First, Julian would enroll in a residential treatment center for gambling addiction, completely funded by my personal savings, not from Grandma Eleanor's trust. Ongoing support would depend entirely on his full engagement in the recovery process. Second, I would assist Vivian and Charles in creating a practical financial recovery strategy, potentially including downsizing their home, restructuring Charles's law practice, and exploring legitimate debt consolidation. Again, any financial help from me would come from my own funds entirely separate from the trust. Third, we would tackle Julian's debts methodically. We'd begin by negotiating payment arrangements with legal creditors and coordinating with the proper authorities to handle threats from predatory lenders. I'd be willing to contribute toward verified debts, but only after Julian had committed to treatment, and only for liabilities backed by documentation. This isn't a blank check, I made clear. This is structured conditional support. I'm offering help for healing, not fuel for more chaos. If old habits resurface, the help ends. Immediately, you're not in a position to make demands of us. Charles began, his tone rising, but Vivian stopped him with a quiet, steady voice. Charles, enough, just stop. Her voice, though weary, was more certain than I'd heard in years. Caroline's right, she said softly. We've been going about this the wrong way for far too long. Julian lifted his head, visibly taken aback by her words. We failed you, Julian, she continued, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. Not by saying no to your debts, but by always saying yes. By rescuing you every time. By never letting you deal with the consequences of your choices. It was the first real exchange I could recall witnessing between them in years. Over the next 3 hours, with Edward Lawson and Charlotte Hayes guiding the conversation, we carefully worked through the specifics. Vivienne and Charles agreed to participate in financial counseling and to keep their finances transparent moving forward. Julian committed to entering the treatment facility the following week. We laid down firm boundaries, clear expectations for everyone involved. As they got ready to leave, Julian lingered behind, waiting until our parents stepped outside. I don't think I've earned your help, he murmured. This isn't about earning it, I answered gently. This is about family, showing up in a way that actually supports healing, not perpetuates damage. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in our adult lives, I felt a moment of understanding pass between us. Quiet, but unmistakable. The next week, I personally drove Julian to the recovery center, an established facility just beyond the city limits. As we pulled into the drive, he turned toward me. I'm scared, he confessed. That's a good thing, I told him honestly. It means you're finally realizing what's at stake. What if I mess up again? I paused, choosing my words with care. Then, you'll have to summon the strength to try again. But this time, you'll be doing it with someone who's standing beside your healing, not your addiction. There's a difference. Watching him walk through the doors of the facility, I was surprised by what I felt. Not certainty, not relief, but something quieter, stronger, hope. 6 months later, I stood on the wide front porch of the Vermont house, the crisp air wrapping around me as golden leaves fluttered across the grass. Eleanor Whitmore had always said that autumn was when the house revealed its true beauty, with crimson maples lining the path, perfectly framing the white colonial against the backdrop of distant mountains. The renovation was nearly finished. I had fulfilled her wishes by collaborating with preservation specialists to retain the estate's historic charm while upgrading the core infrastructure. This weekend marked my first full day here since the project's completion. My phone buzzed a message from Isabel Kensington. How's the peace and quiet treating you? Feeling ready for guests yet? I smiled as I typed back. Maybe next weekend. Still unpacking everything mentally, emotionally. And there was a lot to unpack. The last 6 months had been a journey of redefining boundaries and slowly rebuilding connections with healthier foundations. Julian had finished a 90-day inpatient rehab program and was now living in a transitional recovery home. He attended daily GA meetings and had recently started working at a nearby garden center. It wasn't glamorous compared to his past ambitions, but it was stable and calm. More than anything, he was beginning to own his path forward step by step, one day at a time. My parents had also made some significant changes, though not without hesitation. They had finally sold the oversized family property and moved into a manageable condo. Charles had merged his faltering law firm with a younger practice, and now worked part-time in an of-counsel role. Financially, they were still walking a tightrope, but for the first time in years, they weren't drowning. The bonds between us were still delicate. There were moments when tension crept in, and familiar dysfunctional habits threatened to reappear. But underneath it all, there was a newfound transparency between everyone. Vivian and Charles had let go of the illusion that everything was fine, and I had stopped holding out hope that they would become people they simply weren't. "You really shifted something in them," Isabel Kensington remarked during our most recent lunch. "By standing your ground, you forced them to evolve." "They only changed when they had no other choice," I corrected her gently. "I just stopped being the fallback plan. That's all." Now, sitting on the wraparound porch that had seen 4 generations gather, I sipped my coffee and considered the real legacy Eleanor Whitmore had left behind. Yes, there were tangible things: the estate, the portfolio, the treasured keepsakes. But more than any of that, she had given me something deeper: the strength to enforce boundaries, and the clarity to tell the difference between offering support and enabling dysfunction. A vehicle turned onto the long gravel drive. It wasn't planned, but I recognized it instantly: Ethan Caldwell's blue Subaru. We'd been talking more lately, slowly rekindling a friendship, now that the pain from our divorce had finally started to soften. "Hope this isn't a bad time," he said, stepping out of the car. "I'm headed to a conference in Burlington, and realized you were nearby." "Actually perfect timing," I said, meaning it. "Coffee's still hot." We sat down together on the porch, and I found myself telling him everything that had happened over the last 6 months, details I hadn't shared with anyone besides Isabel. When I finally finished, he looked at me and said, "I'm proud of you. I always knew this strength was in you. And your grandmother, she definitely saw it." I hesitated, the honesty still a bit raw. "Sometimes I still feel guilty," I admitted quietly. "Like I should have stepped up sooner." "You stepped in when the time was right for you," Ethan Caldwell said gently. "That's all anyone can really ask." Later that same afternoon, I got a surprise phone call from Julian Whitmore. "Just wanted to touch base," he said, his tone more grounded than I'd heard in years. "Today marks 6 months sober." "That's incredible," I told him, genuinely moved. "How are you feeling?" "Grateful," he admitted. "Nervous sometimes. But mostly, I just feel present." He paused for a long second. "I needed to thank you not only for helping me get into treatment, but for not turning your back on me completely. You had every reason to." "That's not how real families work," I replied. "True family sets boundaries and tells the truth, but doesn't walk away." After we hung up, I made my way to the library, Eleanor Whitmore's most cherished room in the entire house. I had kept everything just as she'd left it: shelves lined with worn, leather-bound books, and her favorite reading chair nestled by the window. From the drawer in her old desk, I pulled out a small velvet box containing the emerald necklace she had promised me the day I graduated. As I opened it, a folded note slipped out, a letter I'd never seen before, written in her unmistakable handwriting. "My dearest Caroline, if you found this, it means you've taken over the Vermont house, and checked the one drawer I knew you'd eventually open. I left these things to you not just because I trusted you to care for them, but because you were the only one who truly saw their worth, beyond dollars and deeds. A true family legacy isn't defined by houses or heirlooms. It lives on through the values that withstand time: courage, integrity, self-worth, and Caroline, you possess those in abundance. There may come a day when Charles Vivian or Julian Whitmore try to lay claim to what I've entrusted to you. When that time comes, hold your ground. Not out of greed, but because sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let others feel the weight of their own decisions. Whatever unfolds, never forget. The greatest thing I've passed down to you doesn't sit in safes or lie in property titles. It's the resilience I've always seen in you. The kind of strength that makes the hard decisions and keeps walking the right path even when it hurts. With all my love, Grandma Eleanor, tears filled my eyes as I gently folded the letter back into its envelope. She had foreseen all of this, and instead of just passing down wealth, she left me the insight to protect it, and myself. That evening, I gathered everyone for a quiet dinner at the house Charles and Vivian, Julian, Ethan, Isabel, and Henry Whitmore. It was the first time all of us had shared a table since that emotional reckoning 6 months ago. There were still uneasy silences, remnants of old wounds just under the surface, but there was also laughter, real, unforced conversation. As I looked around the table that had witnessed decades of Whitmore family meals, I recognized something unexpected. This flawed, healing, ever-changing bond between us was part of my inheritance, too. Not just the estate Eleanor Whitmore left behind, but the dream she always carried in her heart. That someday, we might actually become a family worth fighting for. Some legacies aren't locked in safes or written on deeds. They live in the people we choose to keep, and how we choose to begin again. What my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, truly passed down to me weren't just possessions, but her bravery and unshakable sense of dignity, gifts that no one can ever take from me. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have stood your ground to safeguard your legacy, or chosen to divide it, even knowing the consequences? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of holding your own, while still honoring the bonds of family, resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life journeys just like this one. And always keep in mind, the most meaningful inheritance isn't found in bank accounts. It's found in the strength to value yourself and the courage to say enough. Thank you for watching. And wherever you are in your life, I hope you find the inner resolve to protect your peace and set the boundaries you deserve.